the other thing I would do on the final day of a class, if we were in class, and this class that you guys are taking would have been an online class, fully online. It was scheduled to be online. So if this had been normal times, I wouldn't even be doing this. Like, I wasn't doing Zoom Q&As for my online classes ever. And maybe I probably will now. So this is basically like, this wouldn't be happening. Pretty much the rest of the class I designed exactly the way I would have designed an online class, which is that there's the same exact cycle every week, has the same set of assignments so that you can kind of get into a rhythm. Oh, that's right. The other thing about the PoliSci 416, which is the remote class that's asynchronous, it's going to be, this is one of the things I've taken from this summer, is I'm going to do instead of a 10-week class, I'm going to do a 4-module class. And so there will be 10 weeks of the term, but the class will proceed through 4 modules. And so instead of having 1 week per module like we do this summer, 2 of the modules have 2 weeks and 2 of them have 3 weeks. And so the work will be chunked out in 4 chunks, and the content is divided up just like I divided up these 4 weeks.
I really enjoyed that format, by the way. I really did.
Good. I'm glad. And
Yeah.
you know, you're nodding, Maria. You as well.
Oh yeah. I think with the format that you did a great job of creating the environment of a group collaboration in the discussions while we were graded on our participation individually, where previously I've had experiences in a group participation situation where somebody flakes out, and then it affects your grade. So I felt like it was just a very engaging and really
Great.
good thing. Yeah. And I will be in political thought class. It's my very last class in my degree requirement. So I'm actually coming back. I have taken some time off, and so that's my last class. So I'm glad you're teaching it.
All right. And we'll be in the room. So get yourself an interesting looking mask, not a scary one. That's my request. One that have like the skull face thing. I don't think that's so much. It's a little too on the nose as far as I'm concerned. No, I don't care what your mask looks like. That's good to know. And I feel like it's going to be interesting to do a 4-module class in a 10-week format, which I've never done before, but I think that this is the time to experiment. And I think it's going to work out. So this class, so what I would do if this were the last day, I would pretty much try to wrap everything in like a nice bundle and just hand it and say, here's what the class was about. And for this class, I think it's pretty easy to do that. Some classes I struggled to be like, well, what was the whole point? But the class about interest groups is pretty much, I just wanted to give you a sense that our political system is, to a great extent, a battleground, which sometimes involves cooperation, coalitions, like battles do, right? There's allies and there's collaboration and cooperation in wartime, but it's basically, it's a battleground where organized groups that have organized around some kind of specific interest or set of interests that range from totally material, just getting your slice of the pie, to completely value-based or ideological, like making the thing that you think is right or wrong into law. That what a democratic political system is a struggle among interest groups. And that all interest groups have relative amount of resources that they can make use of to advance their cause. And part of what interest groups do is they try to maximize their resources, and they try to make the most effective and efficient use of them. And maybe one of the things, as I think about it, even as I just said that, one of the things that is true, though, in the real world, that's the sort of, we can describe, like, interest groups are trying to maximize and efficiently use their resources in order to get policy that meets the goals of their interests that got them to organize in the first place. That's exactly what they're doing, but different groups actually use their resources better than others. So not all groups, I'm not an economist who is going to assume that all groups are using their available resources to their maximal ability. Some groups, the people who are running it, aren't as good as other groups. And of course, what's definitely true is that some groups, depending on what their interest is, have more readily available resources of one kind or another. Though there's no, I hope you also take out of this that there's no one group that, or one type of group that has the highest level of all resources. And in fact, it's usually there's trade-offs. The biggest resources are time and energy, membership size, so voters, and then money. And typically, when you have a lot of one of those, you don't have very much of the other ones. And so you have to make make use with that. And so groups that have a lot of money tend not to have as much membership. And groups that have a lot of money, though, do tend to be more efficient than groups because they're smaller, and two, they're usually focused on financial outcomes. So their policy concerns are directly tied to a pretty straightforward, simple thing. Like, we want less regulation and more tax breaks and more subsidies and a regulatory environment that is least expensive and most beneficial. So, but different groups, depending on who the leadership is, they do a better or worse job of making use of their resources. Sometimes people make bad decisions and they put too much effort into maximizing their supply of resources and not in using them efficiently, or they spend a lot of resources, for example, raising money, a lot of money raising money, or a lot of time and energy raising money, when they could have used that time and energy to actually do something that does a better thing than money. Like if you spend a lot of time and energy organizing people to go on letter writing campaigns and go to protests and go testify before legislative committees and get involved in election campaigns to get favorable candidates elected. If you spend a ton of time and energy doing that, you could end up with a lot more influence than if you spend a lot of time raising money and then spending that money on lobbying efforts or political contributions. Some groups are better off using financial resources, and some groups are better off using time and energy and membership size. But in the real world, the struggle abstractly, would occur among fully rational, fully efficient, fully effective groups, maximizing their haul of resources and utilizing them most effectively. But in reality, some groups are better than others. And one of the things that happens, and this was part of this week, the wrap up of giving you an overview of how things really look. Part of it is the people, the specific individual people who are involved in certain kinds of groups. And if you have if you represent a large block of voters in a state, and your leadership is just not very politically savvy, and the people who are running that organization, who essentially decided to dedicate their lives to this organization instead of to getting an outside job, they're the ones who are okay, I'm gonna work full time for this organization. Let's say it's the League of Conservation Voters, which is an interest group in Oregon that is very prominent. The environment is so important, and Oregon's natural resources and natural environment are so important. I'm gonna take a leadership position. I'm gonna work for this. I'm gonna make less money than I would make if I were working in the private sector. Maybe I'm a lawyer and I can make a lot of money in the private sector, but I'm gonna work for this NGO. And you may not necessarily be politically savvy just because you're politically committed. And people who have the highest level of political abilities might say, well, you know what? I'm going to go to work as a hired gun running campaigns for candidates for governor and secretary of state, state legislature, and city council, because I know what I'm doing. I'm good and I can make a lot of money. And so the best talent doesn't always go into interest groups. And then that's one of the things about maximizing financial return too, is that if you are you have a lot of financial resources, you can then hire the best talent. Unfortunately, the League of Conservation Voters is not capable of buying the best talent. Now, that doesn't mean that if you can't pay top salaries that you're automatic. They don't want to equate lower salaries with lower quality people, because some people will, in fact, are super talented and they're living up to their values by saying, well, I could make a ton of money in the private sector, but I'm going to put my work where my values are, not where, and my values being, non-material values. So different individuals also, back in week one, and I always repeat this and emphasize it because I do think that when people hear the term interests, they almost always default back to the idea that interests are material interests and that interests are self-interests only. But our interests are whatever we think is important for us in the world to manifest. And it could be making a lot of money. It could be caring for your family. It could be quality time. It could be travel. It could be a moral thing like protecting the unborn or making sure that women have an expansive set of reproductive rights. Whatever it happens to be, there are definitely people who are kick-ass at politics who say, well, living up to my values means that I'm going to take less salary to do something that I think is good for the world. And so there are plenty of badasses in working for bad salaries. And that's true in teaching too. Like there are plenty of K through 12 teachers who are people who could make more money, but they're just like, it's their calling. But the distribution of talent and commitment and skill isn't even across interest groups, and it fluctuates. So if like the League of Conservation Voters has somebody who's the executive director who's not particularly politically savvy, but is totally dedicated to the cause, and isn't really doing a very good job, then part of the internal struggle in that organization, the membership and other people who are in leadership positions, is to get rid of that person or the people who are not effectively working and to replace them. And so there's internal politics as well. The NRA recently actually had, and they're still kind of undergoing it, but had an internal power struggle that centered around corruption, which does sometimes happen. It happens in union leadership all the time. Unions are very effective, powerful interest groups, but there's often corruption scandals because people who have access to all those resources that the giant unions, which have a lot of members and they have dues, so they actually have pretty good financial resources. Corruption is very tempting at that level. And so those people, so part of the internal struggle is to keep a leadership of your group that actually is savvy, dedicated, skillful, and honest. And those traits are not always distributed evenly throughout the system. So what we don't get is we don't necessarily get as an outcome in our political system a fully rational, like, okay, all these groups, their resources are distributed, however they're distributed based on what they represent. So if you represent an interest that millions of people share, you have more votes. If you represent an interest that a key sector of the economy, like the banking industry, represents, then you have essentially automatic political capital. Those resources, potential resources, are not distributed evenly across the playing field, and they're not necessarily distributed equally in terms of talent and skill and dedication and honesty. And so the outcomes are not always what you might expect if you punched this stuff all into a computer. Politics is still like I won't say dirty, but it's a grubby human endeavor where outcomes are kind of hard to predict. But we can see who usually wins. And one of the things is that the groups that usually win are the ones that have a lot of unity, a lot of voter support, those two things tie together, a lot of financial resources, and that have really important connections in the community. And in American political society, the biggest connection you can have in the community for political power is if you're key to the economy. And I think Connor, was talking about this last time, how like public elected officials will, they'll do the bidding of major employers in their state or their district without even being asked, because they know that their political survival depends on the state of the economy. They know that whatever issues are important to voters in their district, that the economy is always important. And so without even being asked, city council members in Seattle, they don't need a phone call from Amazon's lobbyist in order to be thinking about Amazon. Now, it doesn't mean Amazon's always going to win, but in fact, it's kind of like rich people don't have to pay for stuff a lot of times. Like the more money you have, the less you have to pay for stuff. The more economic clout you have, the less you actually have to directly ask elected officials. And that's a weird resource too. And that's one of the reasons why, I shouldn't say weird, that's a resource. That's, in a way, that's political capital. Elected officials and elected hopefuls are going to pay attention to your interest, not because you've influenced them, but because they believe that your interests align with their interest, which is, if I make sure that Boeing doesn't leave Seattle, or if I make sure Amazon doesn't leave Seattle, or if I make sure that the baseball team doesn't leave town or the basketball team doesn't leave town, then the voters will be happy and they will reward me. Because
I was wondering if you could give me a little clarification on this though. Like you mentioned Boeing, for instance, you mentioned Amazon. And so two very large companies and two very sort of regionally, at least for some areas, very regionally specific.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, oftentimes, the bigger the companies, and those are the ones that, like you said, they don't have to really say anything. It's what they say goes no matter
Right.
what. But oftentimes, the people, their constituents or stakeholders, even non-employees, are suffering because of their actions at the larger levels. Not
Right.
always. Granted, they can be helpful, but like, the pay and the health conditions and Amazon's thing, like Boeing and all those terrible things they have going on, and they got all those loans and now they're just paying out their shareholders.
Right.
Like,
Well, and in Amazon's case particularly, Amazon's presence in Seattle, and I lived in Seattle for 17 years during the rise of Amazon,
oh wow,
and one of the things that's clear to most people is that Amazon's place in the Seattle economy has actually contributed significantly to the homelessness problem there, has contributed significantly to essentially middle-class displacement because all of these Amazon employees are essentially, crowding the city, and rents are being driven up, and Amazon itself is a lucrative company, so their executives are all making good money. It's like Microsoft did the same thing to the Seattle region as well, and
I saw it in San Francisco when I lived in downtown, like just outside the Tenderloin. It's the same thing
right.
with the tech guys.
And so one of the things that does happen, and this is also to say that elected officials don't always make what we might think of as the optimal calculation for what's best for their constituents. You might say, well, getting rid of Amazon is the best thing ultimately long term, or not siding with Boeing so that the workers who are having difficulty, getting good working conditions and good pay, like just let them go. And in the long run, the people who are being essentially hurt by the major corporations will be unhurt by them or less hurt by them. Part of the problem is that politics is played in the short term, not in the long term. And when you're an elected official, you can't, this is one of the reasons why people sometimes praise dictatorships like China. You can put into place a 20-year plan when you don't have to run for re-election 5 times in that 20 years. It's very difficult. So one, there's that short-term thinking, and a lot of the problems that major employers create are kind of long-term problems that would require a long-term fix. But also, elected officials often, just because they're paying attention to the economy and caring and like essentially fretting that they don't screw up the local economy or the statewide economy, it doesn't mean that they actually make policy that is economically rational or economically optimal. When you're reading the policy questions through the lens, at least partly, of the political environment, you're not necessarily going to be able to make the best policy. And this is part of the struggle in any democratic society between expert-driven decisions and elected official-driven decisions, is that experts aren't people who have to worry about pleasing people in the short term. They can actually make a more rational analysis of policy, but they also are disconnected with the people. And so they don't actually have to care about the impact of their decisions. Elected officials don't have the luxury of long-term planning. They don't have the luxury of looking at policies from a purely rational point of view, but they are forced to care about people. So there's trade-offs in both of those. And one of the dances in any democratic society is between expert-driven policy and elected official-driven policy. And there's no right answer, because basically, like, our judiciary are a bunch of unelected experts in judicial logic and in legal reasoning, and in some ways that's awesome, and in some ways that's terrible. And so that's part of what, like, elected officials. So whatever mix we as a society take, and it's always kind of there's always this push and pull. I think that the pandemic is going to give experts who've been kind of on their heels for a while in American political culture, it's going to give them a little boost, because people are going to be like, oh yeah, people who study something, who aren't worried about politics, they're the ones we ought to be listening to. Whereas there's been kind of this slow, decades-long movement away from relying on experts. And I don't necessarily think that the pandemic will like put the experts back on top, but it will at least for a moment, and that moment may last 5 years, it may last 6 months, it may last a decade. For a moment, it will make people more likely to think that we ought to have policy that's driven by experts instead of elected officials. But elected officials themselves, they miscalculate policy all the time. They also miscalculate the political landscape. You know, just because you've been elected 4 or 5 times in a row doesn't mean you're necessarily always going to win re-election because you're clearly really good at it. It may just be that you've always had pretty easy elections to run, and you've gotten complacent in reading the political environment, and you help your major employer, and people turn against you. I mean, that happened in Seattle too. You know, so there were some insurgent candidates for city council that said, "Hey, fuck Amazon. We're gonna we're going to come at them, and we're gonna also like prioritize the homelessness problem, which is connected to Amazon's economic dominance in the downtown core, or actually throughout the entire city." And the city council members who thought they were doing the right thing, they didn't read the new political landscape as successfully as they could. So everybody makes mistakes. That's one of the things. Like, it seems, I mean, Mitch McConnell, you know, he's top notch. That guy, he is top notch. He is one badass political manipulator. He could be miscalculating right now, and it happens. And you know, even Muhammad Ali gets beaten eventually. And I think did I use that analogy last week? Or was I just in a conversation with somebody where I talked about how eventually Muhammad Ali has to get his ass kicked, even if he is the greatest? That might have been personal. So that is like, Connor, to address, I hope it addresses your question, is like, sometimes we can look at from the outside and say, God, but serving the economic interests of these big corporations is actually not good for your constituents. That you may be right, and elected officials and their strategists might disagree with you, and they might be wrong.
Well, and that's the thing too. The thing is too, it kind of, you segue perfectly into that whole conversation about experts, where like, I certainly am not an expert in that, but all I have to do is I can look at any number of studies over the last, decades, and seen wealth disparities get bigger and all these things because we allow these larger interests, not always for the negative, right, but a lot of the time for the negative. And it's been a detriment, at least a net detriment, to the average employed worker or unemployed worker.
And that's where it comes back to, I think, the background condition of the American political culture, which is that we have a fundamentally pro-capitalist, individualistic, anti-authoritarian political culture, all of which, you know, basically mean that by default, what corporations want in terms of policy is likely to be acceptable to the American people, regardless of what the consequences are. So, like, you know, we can look at 21st century capitalism and say it's increasing the wealth disparity like it hasn't since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, and it is creating conditions for its own sort of like these deep recessions, and corporations don't really care, and they're not here to serve American workers. They're just there to serve their profits. And yet the vast majority of Americans are fundamentally pro-capitalist. So policy has to be made within that broader context of what Americans will and won't find acceptable. And to a large extent, it means that the options that are the realistic options available to policymakers in terms of economic policy is a small set of what's really available in theory, right? So you have here's the giant set of policies that you can make to alleviate suffering, to make sure that everybody has a decent standard of living, to make sure there's some kind of financial security, to make sure that wealth disparities don't get out of control so that actually the economic system becomes sort of unstable. And the set that's acceptable to the American people is this big. And sometimes that set is not up to the task of solving whatever problem is at hand. So that's the background condition. And every country has a political culture that essentially shrinks the set of theoretically available policies to a smaller set. And it depends on what the policy area is. And in economic policy, because of our fundamentally individualistic, pro-capitalist, anti-government, you know, like, people are suspicious of government. They think corporations are more efficient than governments, when in fact, governments can actually often be very efficient, especially because they don't have to make a profit for their shareholders. So they don't have to actually generate so much revenue and cut costs so much. But like, there's no nationalizing industries in our political culture, even if that would be rational. There's no government takeovers, even like, you know, even in a time of a pandemic. Imagine that Bernie Sanders had been president, and he said, I'm going to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry, or I'm going to, use the defense whatever act, I forget the name of it. Diane, what's the name of that act? Connor,
Defense Production Act.
Defense Production. I was like, it's not Defense Appropriation. I'm going to use the Defense Production Act to essentially dictate to corporations to what they have to make, and we're going to pump out ventilators, we're going to pump out tests. That level of invasion that a guy like Bernie Sanders would find like very natural, and that in fact might be what is required to be up to the task of handling a pandemic in a country of 350 million people who are highly mobile and who hate to be told what to do. But like I think about the rebellion against such a thing, even if it's like the most sensible policy, it just falls outside the boundaries of what I think most Americans would find acceptable. And, Bernie would probably do it and then he would suffer. He wouldn't get reelected. So this is all speculation, obviously, like I can't say for sure, but it's just to illustrate the fact that in the interest group struggle, another one of the resources that groups have, and I guess I didn't probably make this point abundant enough in the lectures, but another resource that groups have is how far from the mainstream or how close to the mainstream of American political culture does that group's preferred policies fall. So, if you have a set of policies that would involve wholesale, for example, reform and restructuring of police departments, that falls farther from like what's mainstream. I'm not saying that's outside the set of possible, but it falls farther from what's mainstream than people whose proposals are to, for example, have civilian oversight boards. If you want to, if you think it's a smart thing to move a lot of resources from the militarization of the police, from providing riot gear, from providing, like more SWAT teams than they need, to like hiring an army of mental health experts and counselors to go out to domestic violence situations and drug situations and situations of like, basically where people are like active shooters who have mental problems. The idea of paying lots of mental health workers instead of paying police more and arming them more, unfortunately, and maybe this will change, and I think it may change, but like at this moment in time, and certainly 6 months ago, that fell farther out of the mainstream. And so the groups pushing for that have a harder time in the interest group struggle. And that's another thing I think that I would want to get across in my wrap up of this class, is that every group not only has resources that they can make use of, that they can maximize, that they can use efficiently or not, that every group also has a set, kind of a given set of opportunities and obstacles. Opportunities are, for example, when what they want actually aligns with the dominant culture, or what they want aligns with some new set of consciousness. So one thing about this summer of protests is that it has the potential to realign what is more acceptable or what's more mainstream. So the things that Black Lives Matter activists were asking for 4 years ago, which were probably unrealistic to even expect, are now definitely realistic. They're not, it's not a slam dunk, that's for sure. But because of a change in the political climate, the realm of the possible becomes broader. And so that obstacle that Black Lives Matter activists were asking for, things that most people wouldn't consider, has been reduced. And that's one of the reasons why you go to work on public opinion, why you try to change the political environment if you can. But usually what happens is there are opportunities to have an impact on the political environment, and you make use of that or you don't. One of the things that has always remained a mystery to me, a partial mystery, is how it is that the basically regular occurrence of mass shootings has not provided gun control advocates with more of an opportunity to shift the political landscape. And then the only reason why it's not a total mystery to me is that the NRA is so good. Like, they operate at the highest level. I feel like the NRA uses even with the corruption, they use their resources so well. They have an abundance of membership size. They have unity. They have they have enough financial resources that they can pay the best people. They don't donate a ton of money to campaigns. They use their money wisely. They don't have a shit ton of money compared to other groups, but they use their money extremely wisely. And so the NRA always for me is like, oh yeah, you know, even facing what would to other groups be major obstacles. In other words, there is a regular occurrence of high profile current events that outrage people and make them call for policy changes. And they can successfully play defense against that year in and year out. And I keep waiting, for it to stumble. And I thought for sure, I'm like, well, we're at least going to get bump stock regulation. And that was a thing that was seemed likely for maybe 5 days, and then it just disappeared. So every group has obstacles and opportunities. The landscape of obstacles and opportunities does shift. It's very difficult to shift that on your own, to be like, okay, the obstacle that most people think that cops who shoot black people are just bad apples, that it's not systemic racism. That's an obstacle. That obstacle is potentially transforming, and more Americans are actually saying, oh, I think that racial violence among police is actually systemic and not just bad cops who, you know, of course there's going to be bad apples in any barrel. So those are the kinds of things that can change the landscape. And then of course, protests, a savvy media strategy, prolonged messaging to the American people, those can have an impact on the political environment as well. And I mean, I think it's amazing that we're living through right now what is potentially a paradigm shift in our attitude about experts. And I think it may go beyond just health experts, but it certainly is there. And we're possibly going through a paradigm shift in how Americans think about racism as either systemic or just a few racists who we can safely ignore because there are not that many of them. We may be going through a paradigm shift in the way Americans think about our federal system even, because one of the things that's interesting is that we're seeing so much from state level officials now because of the, essentially, I won't even say colossal failure of the Trump administration, like the colossal just giving up. Like it doesn't even look like Trump even wants to talk about it or think about the fact that there's this worsening pandemic. It's like it's the clearest case of magical thinking that I think I've ever seen in American politics. But what it's doing is it's having an impact. It'll have an impact on the presidential election, but what it may actually also have is that people are going to think more about state and local government as a place to, put their activism, to put their attention, to put their hopes and their desires. Federalism is such a weird, abstract concept that I don't necessarily think that it's going to flow off the lips of most Americans for a very long time. But this is a moment where we're seeing the rise of that as well. Like people are probably learning who their mayor is, and in places where they didn't even know they had a mayor. They knew they had a mayor because that's folktales all have mayors running these little towns, but they couldn't have named their mayor. Many people probably couldn't have even named their governor, and now their governor is on television weekly or daily. So that all of those things could be and are having an impact on how interest groups are going to be prosecuting their activities in this overall struggle. So I guess to get back to what I started to the wrap up is that I hope that in this class you've all learned to to see democratic politics as fundamentally a struggle among competing interest groups with different levels of resources and efficiency and different landscapes of opportunities and obstacles. And then also seen and learned about the specific avenues that they use to try to pursue victory, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And the dynamics in each of those domains are quite different. And that I would say is the biggest thing is that besides knowing that democratic politics is a struggle among interest groups with unequally distributed resources, but that there are really different dynamics at working through each of the three main avenues. And then there's different dynamics that are internal to each of these organizations. The smaller and more unified an organization is, the less there's an internal struggle. The more an organization represents an interest that has connections with other people's interests, the more opportunities there are for collaboration and coalitions. The more a group's interests relate to a singular issue, like for example, tax cuts, the more opportunity there is to actually have common ground with and total unity with other groups who represent that same kind of thing. So all of that's there's the box. I put the bow on it, and now you can take that with you out into the world.